On April the 15th, 1945, the Germans handed over to us the first concentration camp at Belsen, north of Hanover. We mark this anniversary tonight. On the day when Belsen was opened, I went in with the chief doctor of the Second Army. And that night, 20 years ago, I recorded a report for the BBC that was broadcast next day.
Far away in a corner of Belsen camp, there is a pit, the size of a tennis court. It's 15 feet deep, and at one end, it's piled to the very top with naked bodies that have been tumbled in one on top of the other. Like this must have been the plague pits in England 300 years ago. Only nowadays, we can help by digging them quicker with bulldozers, and already there's a bulldozer at work in Belsen.
My father had been working in the BBC since 1936, first reporter for the BBC. He became, in 1939, the BBC's first war correspondent, when on the day that war was declared by Chamberlain, the 3rd of September 1939, he set off to France, where it was widely presumed the war was going to be focused between the Allies, the British and the French on the one side, and on the other side, of course, the Germans. When he left, there was a great fanfare. The BBC on Radio Times front cover said, "On this trip, Dimbleby goes alone." He didn't actually have a very good sound recordist with him, but, you know, that always happens. He then joined the RAF, not as a fighter, but as an observer, BBC correspondent. And that was quite hairy, some of that. There were in the war altogether 3 BBC air correspondents. My father flew more flights than any other, and he was the only one who survived the war. He did the first flight in a bomber over Berlin and recorded it for broadcasting.
The Berlin raid was a big show, as heavy bomber operations go. It was also quite a long raid, and the wing commander who took me stayed over Berlin for half an hour. The flak was hot, but it has been hotter. For me, it was a pretty hair-raising experience, and I was glad when it was over, though I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
He hated flying. He hated the thought of going. He was always nervous and airsick. He never told me. My mother told me later. But he reported it very calmly and rather dramatically.
We flew over the city 3 times for more than half an hour, while the guns sought us out and failed to hit us. At last, our bomb aimer sighted his objective below, and for one unpleasant minute we flew steady and straight. Then he pressed the button, and the biggest bomb of the evening, our 3.5-tonner, fell away and down. It was engrossing to realize that the Nazi leaders and their ministries were only a few thousand feet from us, and that this shimmering mass of flares and bombs and gun flashes was their stronghold.
And then D-Day came itself. He was in an unnamed airport in Britain as the first planes took off on the night, the early hours of D-Day, to fly the parachutists, the SAS, over into France. And he then flew over France after that and watched and witnessed all that was happening, sending back reports. By this time, there were a great many British correspondents on the ground, and War Report, a nightly programme, was started up, which was extraordinarily powerful and effective. It was, as it were, near live broadcasting from the front line of a huge war.
Hello, BBC. This is Richard Dimbleby. The British, Canadian and American troops who landed on the coast of France, north of the lovely town of Caen, in broad daylight this morning, are already several miles inland, on a front sufficiently broad to be more than a bridgehead. They are pushing steadily on, backed by the tremendous firepower of heavy British and United States warships, and covered by an ever-changing but ever-present umbrella of fighters.
He was going through into Germany, describing the sort of broadcasting which now is familiar but wasn't in those days. And others, his colleagues, were doing the same, going in, meeting people and talking to them and reporting what German civilians were saying in their sort of bewilderment of what on earth has happened and what is happening to us. And they were at that time liberating lots and lots of concentration camps, prison camps, concentration camps. So Germany was littered with concentration camps. These were not the death camps. These weren't the Auschwitzes. These were prison camps where people were just corralled, and a whole range of people, civilians and captured prisoners of war. And he found himself, he just thought, I can go up with this unit of the British Army. It was Montgomery's Second Army. And he arrived at this place. He'd heard, there's something a bit troublesome about this place. And it was Bergen-Belsen, from which he made a series of extraordinary, searing reports that would never be forgotten by those who heard it, because it was the first revelation of what the Nazis were actually like towards civilians, particularly, and massively towards the Jews. There had been word about it, not a great deal of publicity. Here was terrible evidence. And I think as the reports seared into the national soul, they seared into him as well, the experience.
Beyond the barrier was a whirling cloud of dust, the dust of thousands of slowly moving people, laden in itself with the deadly typhus germ. And with the dust was a smell, sickly and thick, the smell of death and decay, of corruption and filth.
When he came out, Winfried Vaughan Thomas, then a famous broadcaster as well, saw him. And Winfried told me this. He said, I've got to describe this in every detail. He said he was as white as a sheet. I've got to describe it in every detail. He did the dispatch. It was sent back to London. And initially the BBC said, we can't broadcast this because it was so, nothing like that had been heard before. We can't broadcast this. We need corroboration. And according to Winfried, my father then retorted, because he was, this is a 32-year-old young man with the burden of this history on his shoulders. If you don't broadcast this, I will never broadcast again.
This is what the Germans did. Let there be no mistake about it, did deliberately and slowly, to doctors, authors, lawyers, musicians, to professional people of every kind, whom they've turned into animals behind the wire of their cage.
It is remarkable, I think, that such a young man was able very early on, I think this is why he had such an impact at that time, wasn't just an excitable reporter. He had an air of authority, of measured, calm delivery that was oddly reassuring. Dimbleby is there and he is saying this. And he did, in a way which actually got up the noses of some of the people in Broadcasting House. He tended to go beyond the narrow framework of reporting to provide context and background, and not to actually give opinions so much as saying, this is what I'm seeing, going into detail.
Behind the huts, and two youths and two girls who'd found a morsel of food were sitting together on the grass in picnic fashion, sharing it. They were not 6 feet from a pile of decomposing bodies.
The key to all that reporting in that period was detail, detail, detail. Not grand strategy, but detail, because that is what makes people pay attention. And that actually is what war is really about, what happens to real people, whether they're fighting the war or whether they are civilians who are affected by the war. That is war.
Inside the huts, it was even worse. The dead and the dying lay close together. I found a girl. She was a living skeleton. Impossible to gauge her age, for she had practically no hair left on her head, and her face was only a yellow parchment sheet with 2 holes in it for eyes. She was stretching out her stick of an arm and gasping something. It was English, English, medicine, medicine.
He had 2 things. One is an air of authority and gravitas in what he was saying. He used words well, which is critical in broadcasting, and he had an eye for the telling detail. And he loved meeting people. He was endlessly curious. He was often asked, what are the key qualities? He never used the fact that he used words very well as an illustration. He said, curiosity, homework, and hard work. And he'd always say that. Curiosity, curiosity, curiosity. Kills cats but makes broadcasters.
What about the future of Germany? Do you think there's any chance of a dictatorship like Hitler's ever coming back to this country again?
Well, I think there's no chance for a Hitler to come back to Germany again. We have learned a lot in those times of the war, and we've heard such cruel things about things happening in the concentration camps that I'm sure nobody really wants to have a dictator again in this country.
My father never talked to me about the war. I didn't ask him. I was a teenager doing all sorts of things that meant that I wasn't particularly interested. He never raised it at all at any point in his life. I have to presume that it had so seared itself into his mind that going back there, he wouldn't have gone back unless the BBC had said, do you want to go back? I don't think. He wouldn't have gone back as a sort of, horror tourist. But when he went back, you saw the way in which he described it, how he was reliving the horror.
As we swung eastward towards Germany, my thoughts went back to that night in March 1945, when, crouched in the fuselage of a Lancaster with a microphone in my hand, I looked down on our target, the city of Cologne.
I think it was an extraordinarily important experience for him because he had always been an adventurer. He had loved the excitement of journeying, and even parts of the war, Secret Service, carrying bags from hither to there. And I think he did a bit of that. Reporters do things when they have odd experiences that they can make the most of. He went into Hitler's bunker. He actually reported the jerry cans that were allegedly used to burn his body. He sat in Hitler's chair.
In the Reich Chancellery, where Hitler spent his last days, I ended my career as a war correspondent with this last dispatch. Outside Hitler's bunker are 5 petrol cans used for burning his body, and with them the tattered remains of clothing. The whole of this Reich Chancellery has fallen to pieces, and with it have gone the last vestiges of Nazi power. In the center of Hitler's study stands his chair, in a confusion of smashed woodwork, of filth and rubble.
Not entirely sure how they knew that was Hitler's chair, but it was Hitler's chair. But what he certainly did also do was to pick up some cutlery embossed with AH on it, and rather macabrely, I think, brought them home. And they were there. I don't know what happened to them in the end, but they were certainly at home. So I remember seeing them and being told what they were. He loved all that. It was sort of, he could have easily been a spy writer if he'd chosen another life. So there was the excitement as well as the horror. This terrible horror marked him, I'm sure. I think that 3 things were fundamentally important to him, which had been destroyed by the Nazis, or would have been destroyed had they been victorious. Democracy, freedom, and the rule of law. And that meant he revered institutions that were there, the pillars of those powerful ethical values. And I think that was really important to him. And I think it did colour the way in which he saw the world, as well as his ability to use a language which seemed difficult to describe it precisely, but he seemed to find the words that others could not use but would have loved to have been able to use to express their feelings about what they were witnessing through his commentaries.
I want you to come with me now on a quick tour of West Berlin to see what's happened in the past few years.
Despite the severe damage suffered during the war, despite the blockade of 1948, and despite its political isolation, Berlin remains a city of world standing. Today it has an air of freshness and vitality and prosperity, and it's rapidly becoming the most modern city in Western Europe. 200 of the 250 buildings in the Kurfürstendamm were destroyed by war. Now it's a boulevard of restaurants and theaters and nightclubs and exclusive shops.
So when you get to 1959, he is looking forward. He did not want to think back. He was thinking, how do you make a future? And he's questioning, I mean, in that film, it's intriguing that the film stands up very well. I hadn't seen it till very, very recently. It stands up very well in sort of broadcasting terms, well cut, well edited, and all of those characteristics. And his questions are all about little bits about the past, mainly about the future, the rebuilding, because he, like others, understood that Germany had to be rebuilt. Germany had to be recreated out of the rubble.
Now, I would like today to have taken you back to the same place to finish my journey just as I did the original. But alas, today, with the film cameras, we can go no further. We can't get permission to film inside communist Berlin. So what I have done is to bring you to the nearest possible point, to the extremity of the West. And if you like to look just behind me here, look across the open space which is the Iron Curtain. You can see on the other side the remains of Nazi Germany as they are today.
He was the presenter of Panorama for all its life and until he could no longer broadcast because he was too ill. He went back for Panorama on the anniversary in 1965 of the liberation of Belsen and did an astonishing report, walking through the camp, just talking to the camera. And it was a remarkable piece of broadcasting, everything coming from here, no notes, nothing. And with, in television terms, important, it was all one take. And that happened to be and he knew he was very ill with cancer. Happened to turn out to be the last year of his life. It was only months before he then died at the end of 1965. To an outpouring of extraordinary national grief. So it was, that program is seared in my memory.
Gone are the huts and the compounds and the barbed wire and the poor, emaciated, tottering people that were staggering about, and the SS guards, men and women, they've all disappeared. The furnace where they hit them on the head and pushed them in the fire, all this has gone. And on a day like this, cold and rainy, such a contrast to the spring day on which I came here 20 years ago, there's nothing here but the desolation of heathland.
And I look at it, not only as a son, obviously that's my father, but I actually look at it as a professional broadcaster, thinking, oh my goodness, I'm not sure I could have sustained all of that without risk of collapsing on the spot or missing my cue or tripping up or something. Just the professionalism of the broadcast is what actually sticks in my mind. In my job, I've travelled all over the world and I've seen some pretty awful things as well as some rather wonderful things. And I'm absolutely convinced that it is only too easy for a mood to collect, coagulate, and become a poison, and become very powerful as a poison. It only takes extreme populist leaders playing on the fears and anxieties of individuals, exploiting them and finding a language which ignites hatred. And I think that to record the event and to say it again matters for each generation as it comes through. And it doesn't get less important.